All right, let's dive into something pretty intense today. We're looking at this former Marine's story. And it's about this experience he had during combat. But it's not your typical war story. It's more about this, spiritual awakening he had.
Yeah.
Triggered by, a near-death experience,
Yeah, it's a fascinating account. This guy, Mark Wilson, talks about this incident that happened to him back in 2011 when he was deployed.
Yeah, what really got me was how intense it was. He doesn't just, tell you what happened. He, takes you through it. All his struggles. How he went from this, dedicated soldier to someone who was, questioning everything.
Right. It really gets you thinking about the impact war can have, not just, physically, but also, mentally and spiritually.
Totally.
And in this case, it was this near-death experience during an ambush. That totally changed his perspective.
So let's get into the details. So the story takes place in this, really remote and tense environment. Mark and his unit were, tasked with monitoring this insurgent activity.
You can just feel the pressure when he describes it. This constant feeling of being surrounded by the enemy. You never know when or where they're going to strike.
Yeah, he talks about the heat, the dust, this eerie silence that just made it even worse. And then everything changes in a flash.
Yeah.
Their convoy gets ambushed.
Yeah.
As they're going through this deserted village.
It's just a brutal reminder of the toll this conflict has taken.
And Mark describes the chaos, the terror of the attack. He said even with all his training, nothing could have prepared him for that.
It's the rawest, most visceral experience you can imagine, being caught in an ambush like that.
And that's the moment that changes everything for him. In the middle of all the chaos, the gunfire, Mark gets shot.
He describes this searing pain, feeling his life slipping away as he loses consciousness.
Yeah, it's a powerful description of how fragile life is, especially in a war zone. But here's where things get really strange. Mark doesn't just black out. He wakes up in this place he can't even describe. He says it's like this infernal realm. Just darkness, fire, and suffering.
It's like he enters this whole other realm, something spiritual and metaphysical.
Right.
And he describes this place. That sounds just like the classic depictions of hell.
It's chilling. All the vivid imagery and sounds, the cries of anguish, the heat, the darkness. It's like a nightmare.
But for Mark, it wasn't a dream. It was real and terrifying. It shook him to his core.
And in this nightmare, he runs into someone he recognizes, his former commanding officer, Colonel Ben Carter.
That's right. And the colonel, he's trapped there too. But he's not the same confident leader Mark remembers. He's tormented, he's carrying the weight of his actions.
And the colonel tells Mark something that completely shatters his understanding of the war. Everything they fought for. He says, quote, "This war is not for freedom. It's fueled by something far darker," end quote.
It's a turning point in the story. The colonel, this figure Mark respected, reveals a completely different perspective. It makes you question everything, the nature of war, the forces behind it.
It's unsettling. And the colonel goes on. He says that his blind obedience, his unwavering commitment to the mission, led him to that place of torment. He warns Mark, quote, "The real enemy isn't out there. It's within us, in the choices we make," end quote.
And that warning, coming from someone Mark admired, adds another layer of complexity. It challenges the whole idea of heroism and sacrifice, because it suggests that even those fighting for a cause can become part of something much darker.
It really makes you think about the motivations for conflict, the justifications for violence, the whole idea of good and evil.
Right, and it makes you wonder, how do people deal with the moral complexities of war when they come face to face with experiences that shatter their beliefs?
The colonel's warning has a huge impact on Mark. He talks about feeling disillusioned, like everything he believed in was a lie.
But it's important to remember that while Mark presents his experience as fact, there are other ways to interpret it. The trauma of war, the extreme stress he went through, those things can have a profound impact on the mind.
So we're dealing with an account that blends personal experience with elements that could be symbolic.
Exactly. And while we have to respect Mark's account and how deeply he believes it, we should also consider other interpretations. For instance, the idea of hell could be a metaphor for the psychological torment he went through, the guilt and anguish.
That makes sense. So we have this compelling story that works on different levels, a personal story of transformation, a spiritual journey, and a reflection on the psychological impact of war.
And within that story, there are valuable insights about resilience, the search for meaning, and how our experiences shape our understanding of the world.
So after this terrifying encounter with the colonel, what happens to Mark? Does he stay trapped in this nightmare?
Well, no. things take another dramatic turn. He's pulled out of the darkness by this blinding light, and he's brought back to the world of the living.
And when he wakes up, he finds himself where?
In a hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses. He's alive, but he's forever changed by what he saw.
It's like he crossed a threshold, experienced something beyond explanation. But his journey isn't over.
You're right. The real challenge begins now, as he tries to reconcile what he saw with the fact that he survived. How do you take something so profound and unsettling and integrate it into your everyday life? How do you find meaning and purpose after seeing what you believe to be hell?
And that's what we're going to explore next. Mark's transformation and the challenges he faces when he returns.
You know, it's not just the near-death experience that's remarkable. It's the change Mark goes through afterward. It really shows you how much these kinds of events can completely change how you see the world.
It makes you think about how we change, especially after something so traumatic. You hear about soldiers struggling to adjust to civilian life. But Mark's experience is a whole other level.
Exactly. He's not just dealing with physical wounds. It's more about reconciling this psychological and spiritual upheaval. His whole understanding of reality is shattered.
Like you were saying before, about different interpretations. I'm curious to explore that more, like from a psychological standpoint.
Yeah.
How could we understand his transformation?
Well, his descriptions of hell,
Right.
meeting the colonel there, those could be seen as symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay.
Extreme stress can trigger hallucinations, flashbacks, distorted perceptions. It's possible that Mark's experience, while it was deeply meaningful to him, could be his mind's way of processing the trauma.
So we have the spiritual interpretation and a possible psychological explanation. How do we make sense of these different perspectives?
I think it's about approaching his story with empathy, but also critical thinking. We can acknowledge the power of his experience, but also recognize the potential influence of psychology. It's not about dismissing his beliefs, but understanding the different factors that might have shaped his narrative.
Right. It's not always a simple explanation,
Exactly.
especially when it comes to something like this.
Yeah. And then there's survivor's guilt. He survived that ambush when others didn't. That can cause intense feelings. Guilt, questioning, searching for meaning. It's natural to ask, why me?
Oh.
And try to make sense of it all.
So survivor's guilt could be another factor in his transformation. He's dealing with the trauma of the ambush and the emotional and psychological aftermath of surviving it.
Exactly. And this search for meaning, it often leads people to reevaluate their beliefs, their values, their whole way of life. For Mark, this reevaluation takes a spiritual turn. He turns to faith, to cope, to find solace, to make sense of what happened.
That seems to be a pattern in a lot of near-death experiences. This heightened spirituality, shifting values, focusing on compassion and empathy.
It's fascinating to see how these transformative events, regardless of where they come from, can lead people down these paths.
Yeah.
Service, activism, wanting to make the world a better place.
It's like they've seen something beyond our everyday reality, something that changes their priorities, makes them want to live differently. And for Mark, this leads him to leave the military and dedicate himself to promoting peace.
That's a big change, going from soldier to peace advocate. It speaks to a deep internal transformation.
It makes you think about individual choice versus these larger forces. Mark's story could be seen as someone breaking free from the system, choosing peace even with his military background. But how much choice do we really have when you consider societal pressures, political ideologies, the complexities of war?
That's a great point. His story really highlights that tension between individual choice and larger forces. We all operate within these systems that shape our beliefs, our actions, our opportunities. But even within those systems, there's always the potential for resistance, for choosing a different path, for standing up against injustice.
So it's about recognizing both the limits and the possibilities of our own choices. We might not be able to dismantle entire systems, but we can make choices that reflect our values.
Exactly. And that's a key takeaway from Mark's story, that transformation is possible. Even within these huge systems, his journey shows us that we can change, that we can grow, that we can make a difference, even when faced with massive challenges.
This takes us back to the Colonel's message about blind obedience, the real enemy being within us. Those words really resonate with Mark's decision to leave the military and pursue peace.
Yeah, it's like the Colonel's message was a catalyst for Mark's transformation, guiding him toward a different path.
And that message makes us think about the bigger implications of Mark's story. If we look beyond the literal interpretation and think about the metaphorical meaning, the Colonel's warning could be seen as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blindly following authority, ideologies, systems that perpetuate violence and injustice.
It encourages us to think critically, question our assumptions, examine the motivations behind the systems we're part of, and consider the consequences of our actions.
So Mark's story isn't just a personal account. It's an invitation to reflect, to examine our own beliefs and actions, and think about our role in creating a more peaceful and just world.
And that's the real power of storytelling. To start conversations, to challenge assumptions, to inspire us to live more consciously. Mark's story might not give us all the answers, but it definitely asks the right questions. Questions that can guide us on our own journeys and help us contribute to positive change.
Mark's story is just so powerful. War, faith, trauma, transformation. It really makes you think about things differently.
Yeah, it really does. It challenges us to dig deeper, look for the meaning behind events, and how those events shape people's perspectives.
We talked about individual choice versus those bigger forces. Makes me wonder, is Mark's story like a smaller version of a bigger struggle? The struggle between those who want violence and those who want peace.
That's an interesting way to look at it. His story could be seen as a symbol of those forces at play in the world. The forces pushing for conflict and those pushing for peace, like his own change, reflects this bigger need in society to move away from violence and find more compassionate ways to deal with conflict.
That really resonates with me, especially these days. With so much conflict and division in the world, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, like your own actions don't matter.
It's true.
But Mark's story reminds us that change is possible, even when things seem impossible.
Exactly. His story shows us that individual choices have a ripple effect. Leaving the military, dedicating himself to peace. It's a powerful act of resistance against a system that just keeps perpetuating violence. It shows that even small acts of courage and compassion can have a huge impact.
It's like a reminder that we don't have to just accept things as they are. We can challenge the norms, question authority, choose a different path.
And it's not just about what we do as individuals. Mark's story shows the importance of working together, too. He had a whole community supporting him, people who shared his commitment to peace and justice. It highlights the power of collective action, of coming together to create a world that reflects our values.
And that brings us back to something we talked about before, empathy and understanding. Mark's story invites us to see things from his point of view, to understand how complex his experience was, and to remember that we're all human.
Empathy is so important, especially when we encounter views that challenge our own. It helps us bridge the gap, build connections, and work together towards a better future.
So as we wrap up our look at Mark's story, what are the key things we can take away? What can we learn from him that we can apply to our own lives?
Well, I think there are a few important things. First, Mark's story reminds us that people can change, even after going through extreme trauma and hardship. His journey shows us how resilient the human spirit is, and how much we can grow and heal.
It's a message of hope. We're not defined by our past. We can learn and grow and create a better future.
Second, it highlights how important it is to question things, to challenge systems that cause violence and injustice. Mark leaving the military and pursuing peace is a call to action for us all, to examine our own beliefs and make choices that align with our values.
It's a reminder that we all have a part to play in making the world a more peaceful place.
And lastly, Mark's story really emphasizes empathy and understanding. It encourages us to see the world through the eyes of others, especially those who have experienced war and violence, to listen to their stories, and to recognize our shared humanity.
It shows us that we're all connected, and that our actions impact others in ways we might not even realize. By choosing empathy, compassion, and understanding, we can create a world where peace is real.
So as we end this deep dive, I hope you'll take some time to think about Mark's story, how it applies to your own life, and find ways to bring those values of peace, compassion, and understanding into your interactions with the world.
Thank you for joining us. Until next time, keep searching, keep questioning, and keep working to make the world a more peaceful and just place.